Grace Whitfield had spent 11 years learning the exact sound the freight elevator made when it reached the fourth floor, and on the morning of December 24th, she heard it stop one floor early. That was the first wrong thing. She stood at the long steel table in the packing room of Hartley Vane, a tissue-wrapped porcelain figurine cradled in both hands, and waited for the elevator to correct itself. It didn't. The doors opened on 3, where the executive offices were, and she heard the particular click of Nathan Vane's shoes on the concrete. He wore leather soles in a warehouse full of people who wore rubber, and you could track him across the whole building by sound alone. She set the figurine down, wrapped it the rest of the way, taped the box. Behind her, Dev was running the label printer and complaining about it, the way he complained about everything, low and constant like a radiator. "Third jam this morning. I swear this thing knows it's a holiday." "Feed it straight," Grace said without turning around. "I am feeding it straight." "You're feeding it at an angle. You always feed it at an angle." He muttered something and fed it straight, and it worked, and he said nothing about that, which was how she knew she'd been right. The packing room smelled of cardboard and the faint chemical sweetness of the foam they used for the fragile pieces. It was the smell of Grace's entire adult life. She had walked into this building at 26 with a baby at home and a marriage coming apart at the seams, and she had asked the woman at the front desk, dead now, 4 years, lung cancer, whether they needed anyone who could pack things carefully. She had meant it as a joke about herself, a small self-deprecating thing to make the asking easier. But Eleanor Hartley had happened to be crossing the lobby at that exact moment, and Eleanor Hartley had stopped and looked at her the way she looked at everything, like she was appraising it for auction, and said, "Careful is the whole business, dear. Come with me." Eleanor was dead now too, 2 years this coming February. That was the thing nobody in the building understood about Grace, or bothered to. They saw a woman in her late 30s who packed boxes and knew where everything was and never raised her voice, and they filed her under warehouse and stopped thinking about her. They did not know that she had spent 11 years being the person Eleanor Hartley talked to when Eleanor Hartley could not sleep, that she knew the provenance of half the inventory by heart, that she could tell a real Meissen from a reproduction across a room, in bad light, which was a skill Eleanor had taught her over 100 late evenings with the good lamp and a loupe, and a bottle of sherry that never seemed to empty. They did not know a great many things. Grace had learned, over 11 years, that the less people knew about you, the more freely they behaved around you, and that what they did when they thought no one who mattered was watching told you everything. The elevator came down to 4. Nathan Vane stepped out. He was 31 and wore his father-in-law's authority like a coat 2 sizes too big, and Grace watched him try to fill it out with his shoulders. Marcus Vane, his father, had married into the company through Eleanor's late business partner, and Nathan had inherited a claim on the place the way you inherit a scar, without earning it and unable to get rid of it. Since Eleanor's death, the ownership of Hartley Vane had been a fog nobody in the warehouse could see through. There were lawyers. There were letters. The names stayed the same, and the paychecks kept coming, and everyone kept their heads down. "Grace," Nathan said her name like it cost him something, "got a minute? I've got a shipment for the Ashford estate going out at 2. Dev can handle it." Dev, at the label printer, went very still in the way of a man who has just been volunteered for something and has learned it's safest not to react. "Dev can't handle the Ashford estate," Grace said. "Half of it isn't insured yet, and the other half is going to 3 different addresses. Dev doesn't know which is which." "Then write it down for him." She looked at Nathan for a moment. There was something in his face she didn't like. Not cruelty. Nathan wasn't cruel. He didn't have the spine for cruelty. It was worse than that. It was embarrassment. He had come down here with something to do, and he was embarrassed to do it. And embarrassed men did the thing anyway, faster, to get it over with. "All right," she said. "Let me get my coat. It's cold in the stairwell." You won't need your coat. But she got it anyway. They didn't go to the stairwell. They went up to 3, to the little conference room with the glass wall that looked out over the loading dock, and when Grace walked in she saw that it was not going to be a conversation. It was going to be a delivery. There was a woman from HR she'd met exactly twice, a thin, nervous person named Paula who kept a folder squared precisely on the table in front of her. There was a security guard by the door, Terrence, who Grace had known for 6 years and who would not meet her eyes and who she immediately forgave, because he had 3 kids and a job and no say in any of this. And there was a man she didn't know, gray suit, sitting at the head of the table like he'd bought it. Grace, Nathan said, this is Roland Vane, the man said. Nathan's uncle. He smiled with the bottom half of his face. I handle the family's business interests. The family's business interests. Grace filed the phrase away. She sat down without being asked, which she could see bothered them, all of them in a small way. She was supposed to stand, or to sit only when invited, because sitting was a thing that belonged to the people who owned the room. She crossed her hands on the table and waited. Paula from HR opened her folder. What followed took 9 minutes, and Grace counted most of them on the wall clock behind Roland's head. There had been a review of warehouse operations. Efficiencies had been identified. The company was consolidating roles. Her position was being eliminated. Not her, they were careful to say, never her, only her position, as though the two things could be surgically separated and only the guilty one removed. There would be 2 weeks severance. Her benefits would continue through the end of the month. They understood the timing was difficult. The timing, Grace repeated. We know it's Christmas Eve, Nathan said, and at least he had the decency to look sick about it. This wasn't, I want you to know this wasn't my. Nathan. Roland's voice was mild, and it shut his nephew's mouth like a hand. Grace looked at Roland Vane. She had never seen him before in her life, and she understood him completely, the way you understand a certain kind of weather the moment you step outside. He was the one who had made the decision. Nathan was the one they'd sent to deliver it because Nathan had a face people trusted, and Roland was here to make sure Nathan didn't lose his nerve. Can I ask a question? Grace said. Of course. Who owns this company? The room changed temperature. Paula's pen stopped. Roland's expression didn't move at all, which was itself an answer. That's not really, Nathan started. Because I've been here 11 years, Grace went on evenly, and in 11 years I have signed shipping manifests, insurance riders, provenance certifications, and customs documents on behalf of Hartley and Vane. My name is on paper all over this building, and I have never once in 11 years seen a document that says who I've been doing all of that for. Alina owned it. Then Alina died, and then it got quiet. She let that sit. So I'm asking, who owns this company? The ownership structure, Roland said, is a private matter. It's about to be my former employer's private matter, so I suppose it doesn't concern me. She stood up. Terrence flinched at the door, ready to intervene, and she gave him a small look. It's fine, I'm not going to be a problem, and he relaxed. I'll need to get my things from downstairs. Someone will bring them up, Paula said quickly, for security. For security, Grace almost laughed. 11 years, and on the last day she was a security risk. There's a photograph of my daughter on the corkboard. It's held up with a green pushpin. And there's a coffee mug that says World's Okayest Packer. It was a joke, Dev gave it to me. That's the personal property. Everything else is yours. She looked at Roland when she said it. Yours. She watched to see if the word landed anywhere. It didn't, or he didn't let it. We'll have them sent to your address, he said. Grace walked out. Terrence held the door for her and murmured, so low that only she could hear it. I'm sorry, Grace. And she squeezed his forearm once and kept walking, because if she'd stopped she might have said something to him that he'd have to report, and she wasn't going to do that to a man with 3 kids on Christmas Eve. She took the stairs. The elevator felt like too much company. Her daughter was 15, and her name was Lily, and she was sitting on the kitchen counter eating cereal out of the box when Grace came in the front door at 11 in the morning, which was 4 hours before Grace was ever home, and Lily knew immediately that something was wrong because she was 15, not stupid, and because Grace's face was doing the thing it did. "What happened?" Lily said, not a question. "I lost my job." Lily set the cereal box down. "Today." "Today?" "On Christmas Eve." Apparently that's when they had an opening in the schedule. Lily slid off the counter. She was tall for 15, taller than Grace now, and it still surprised Grace every time this person she'd made who could look down at her. Can they even do that? Isn't there a law? There has to be a law. There's no law that says a company can't be run by cowards. Grace hung her coat on the hook by the door, the same hook it had hung on for 6 years in this apartment, and the ordinariness of the gesture nearly undid her. She pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes for a second, just a second. Then she took it away. "We're okay. I want you to hear me say that. We're okay. I've got savings. I've got references. I'm good at what I do, and there are other auction houses, and I'll have something by February." "February's 2 months away." "I know how calendars work, Lil. I'm just saying." "I know," Grace softened. "I know you are. Come here." Lily came, and Grace held her, and over her daughter's shoulder she looked at the little artificial tree they'd put up together 3 weeks ago, the one strand of lights doing its slow fade in and out, the 4 presents underneath that Grace had bought in October when she was flush and careful, and she thought, "I will not let this ruin tomorrow. Whatever else happens, tomorrow is going to be normal. She's going to wake up and it's going to be Christmas, and none of this is going to be in the room with us." She was wrong about that, but not in the way she feared. The box from Hartley and Vane arrived 2 days after Christmas by courier, and it was smaller than Grace expected and taped like they thought something might crawl out of it. She signed for it and set it on the kitchen table and didn't open it for an hour, because she knew what was in it. A photograph. A mug, 11 years compressed into a container the size of a microwave, and she wasn't ready to feel that yet. When she finally opened it, everything was there. The photo of Lily with the green pushpin still stuck through the corner. The okayest Packer mug, wrapped, absurdly, in more bubble wrap than they used on the actual porcelain. A phone charger she'd forgotten she kept in her desk. A cardigan. A paperback she'd been reading on lunches. And an envelope. It was a plain white business envelope, and it was sealed, and it had her name on the front in handwriting she recognized. And recognizing it made the back of her neck go cold, because the handwriting belonged to a dead woman. Grace in Alina Hartley's slanting, impatient hand, the G with its long tail, the way she'd signed 1,000 documents Grace had witnessed. Grace sat down. She turned the envelope over. The flap was sealed with a bead of red wax, and pressed into the wax was a mark she knew, the little intaglio seal Alina kept in the top drawer of her desk, a stylized H that she used for personal correspondence and nothing else. Grace had teased her about it once. "Nobody seals letters anymore, Alina." And Alina had said, "That's exactly why I do." Her hands were not entirely steady. She got a knife from the drawer and slid it under the flap, careful of the wax, the way she was careful with everything, and she opened a letter that had been written by a woman who had been dead for 2 years. The letter was dated 14 months before Alina died. "Grace, if you are reading this, then either I have finally had the decency to die, or I have lost my mind, and my lawyer has decided the moment has come to act on the instructions I gave him in a more lucid season. In either case, I am no longer running things, and I am no longer able to protect you the way I would if I were, and that is precisely the situation I have been trying to prepare you for, whether you knew it or not. I want to tell you something, and I want you to sit down before you read it, so if you are standing, sit." Grace was already sitting. She kept reading anyway. "When Charles died, the ownership of this company came to me alone, and it has been mine alone ever since, whatever the Vanes may believe or may have been told. Marcus Vane has a claim to a minority interest through Charles's foolish generosity, and that is all he has, and it is all his son and his brother will ever have, no matter how they conduct themselves in my absence. I know how they will conduct themselves. I have watched Roland Vane circle this business for 15 years the way a patient man watches a house he intends to buy after the owner is dead. He intends to buy this one for nothing. He intends to wait me out and move in and treat the people I care about as line items. I have arranged for him to fail. Grace read that sentence 3 times. In the drawer where I keep the seal, the one you mocked me for, there is a false bottom. Beneath it is a second envelope and a small brass key. The key opens a deposit box at Whitcomb and Reed, the private bank on Ferrier Street, held not in the company's name but in yours. I opened it in your name 4 years ago. You signed the signature card yourself. I told you it was a customs indemnity form, and you signed it without reading it, which I have never stopped finding both charming and alarming. I apologize for the deception. It was necessary. A thing held in your name cannot be found by people searching under mine. Inside that box is the truth about who owns Hartley and Vane, not the story they will tell you. The truth, on paper, notarized and impossible to argue with. I could not leave the company to you outright, Grace. If I had, they would have contested it, tied it up in the courts for a decade, and ground you into dust with lawyers you could not afford to answer. So I did something cleverer and more patient, and it required me to lie to you for 4 years, and I am sorry, and I am not sorry because it will work. Go to the bank, take the key, read what is in the box, and then, my dear, careful girl, be careful in a different way than you have ever let yourself be. Be careful the way I taught you to appraise a forgery. Trust nothing that wants you to look away from it. I did not spend 11 years watching you pack other people's treasures, because I thought you were good at tape. Eleanor. Grace put the letter down on the kitchen table. Outside, a car went by with its chains on, and somewhere down the block a dog was barking at the snow. And inside the apartment the one strand of tree lights faded up and faded down, and Grace Whitfield sat very still and understood that the last 2 days of her life had not been an ending at all. The sealed drawer, Eleanor's desk, which meant Eleanor's office, which was on the 3rd floor of a building she'd been escorted out of, that she was no longer permitted to enter, that had a security guard named Terrence at the door, and a man named Roland Vane sitting at the head of the table like he'd bought it. She thought about that for a while. Then she picked up the letter again and read the last line one more time. I did not spend 11 years watching you pack other people's treasures because I thought you were good at tape. And for the first time since the freight elevator stopped 1 floor early on Christmas Eve, Grace Whitfield smiled. Grace did not go to the bank the next day, though every nerve in her body wanted to. She made herself wait. Waiting was a thing Eleanor had taught her. The amateur reaches for the object, she used to say, turning a piece over under the lamp. The professional reaches for the light first and the loop and a clear half-hour with nobody breathing down her neck. The object isn't going anywhere. Your judgment is. Grace had a deposit box she'd apparently owned for 4 years without knowing it, containing the truth about a company that had thrown her out on Christmas Eve. And the single most dangerous thing she could do was walk into that bank, with her judgment clouded and her hands shaking. So she waited a day. She cleaned the apartment. She made a pot of soup and let Lily think everything was as fine as she kept saying it was. And she thought methodically, the way she'd been taught about what she actually knew, versus what she'd been told, versus what she'd assumed. What she'd been told. Her position had been eliminated for efficiency. What she knew. Roland Vane had come to the building personally, on a holiday, to make sure a warehouse packer was removed. Uncles who handled the family's business interests did not, as a rule, take a personal interest in warehouse staffing on Christmas Eve. Men like Roland delegated. He had not delegated. He had come himself and sat at the head of the table and shut his own nephew's mouth with 2 syllables. which meant she had not been fired for efficiency. She had been fired because she was a problem. Or the thought arrived cold and clean because she was about to become one, and someone knew it before she did. Aline's letter had been in a box of her personal effects, which meant the letter had been in her desk, waiting, for 2 years, or someone had placed it there recently. Grace turned that over and didn't like either answer. If it had been sitting in her desk for 2 years, then the false bottom drawer Aline described had gone unopened all that time, which was possible. Nobody went through a warehouse packer's desk. But if someone had placed the letter in her effects deliberately, on the way out. She stopped. She was doing the thing Aline warned against. She was building a structure out of assumptions and then standing on it. Reach for the light first. The light was at Whitcomb and Reed, on Ferrier Street. She went on the 29th, in her good coat, with Lily at school, and the letter folded in her inside pocket where she could feel it against her ribs. Whitcomb and Reed was the kind of bank that didn't look like a bank. It looked like a solicitor's office that had wandered into money, a narrow Georgian frontage, a brass plate so discreet you'd walk past it, a door that buzzed open only after a woman behind bulletproof glass had looked at you long enough to decide you belonged. Grace had been past it 100 times on errands for the company and never once through the door. She gave her name. She produced her identification, and she watched the woman's face do a small, careful thing when the name came up on the screen, a recognition, quickly smoothed over, that told Grace her name was expected here and had been for 4 years. "Of course, Ms. Whitfield," the woman said. "Do you have the key?" "I'll have the key shortly," Grace said, which was true and which she'd rehearsed because she did not have the key. The key was in a false-bottomed drawer in an office in a building she couldn't enter. "I wanted to confirm the box exists and is active before I made a special trip for it. There was a death in the family and things have been disorganized." It was a good lie because most of it was true, which was the only kind of lie Grace could tell well. Aline had taught her that too, though not on purpose. The woman's manner warmed by a precise professional degree. "I understand completely. Yes, the box is active. It's held in your sole name, established 4 years ago with all fees paid in advance through," she checked, "a further 6 years. You have no co-signatory and no listed beneficiary, which is unusual but not a problem. When you have the key, you're welcome any business day. You'll need identification and the key both. We hold no duplicate. That's rather the point of us." No duplicate. Grace absorbed that. Aline had built a lock that only one key on earth would open, and had hidden that key inside a piece of furniture she knew Hartley Vane would inherit control of. She had made the single most important object in this entire affair sit in plain sight, in a drawer, in an office, surrounded by her enemies. Trust nothing that wants you to look away from it. Aline hadn't hidden the key from the Vanes. She'd hidden it in them. It would never occur to Roland that the thing he most needed to find was in his own dead partner's desk. Because why would the winner search the losing side's furniture? "Thank you," Grace said. "You've been very helpful." "One more thing, Ms. Whitfield." The woman hesitated, then decided. "There's a note on the account, from the person from the account's originator. It's not for release, it's an instruction to us. But I'm permitted to tell you it exists and to tell you this. Should anyone other than you ever attempt to access this box by any legal instrument whatsoever, we are instructed to refuse, to contact you immediately at the number on file, and to preserve the attempt in writing." She looked at Grace steadily. "Someone went to a great deal of trouble to protect you. I've worked here 19 years and I've seen it perhaps 3 times. I thought you should know that it was done, whatever else you may be feeling." Grace stood in the quiet, narrow lobby of a bank that looked like a solicitor's office and felt, for the second time in a week, the ground move under a life she'd thought she understood. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. "To this account." "I know your name is the only one on it," the woman said. "The rest isn't mine to know," she almost smiled. "But I'll say this. People who set up boxes like this one, they're not protecting money. Money you insure. This is the other kind. Now she needed the key, and the key was on the third floor of Hartley and Vane. Grace sat in a cafe across from the bank and drank a coffee she didn't taste and thought about the problem like a shipment. That was how her mind worked. Alina used to laugh at it. You think in freight, Grace. And Grace did. Every problem was a thing that had to get from one place to another, intact, past obstacles, on a schedule, with the right documentation. The key had to get from a drawer on the third floor into her hand. The obstacles were: she was banned from the building, there was a security guard on the door, and the office almost certainly now belonged to Roland Vane or would soon. She could not walk in the front. She was a former employee escorted out, flagged. Terrence would have to stop her. She wouldn't put him in that position, and anyway he'd have to log it. She could not send anyone. There was no one to send. Dev. She trusted Dev about as far as she could throw the label printer, and Dev didn't have access to the third floor. She had, in 11 years, kept her work life and her home life so completely separate that she now had no ally inside the building she could ask to reach into a dead woman's drawer. Except. Grace set the coffee down. Except she did know the building. She knew it better than the people who owned it. She knew that the freight elevator's service key was kept on a hook in the loading dock office because nobody had ever bothered to move it in 11 years. She knew that the third-floor offices were cleaned on Tuesday and Friday evenings by an outside crew who propped the stairwell door with a fire extinguisher because the automatic closer was too heavy, and management had been ignoring the maintenance request since before Alina died. Grace knew that because Grace was the one who'd filed the request 3 times. She knew the alarm on the third floor was zoned separately from the warehouse, and that the Zone 3 keypad code, the last time she'd had reason to know it, had been Alina's late husband's birthday, because Alina was sentimental about exactly one thing, and it was Charles. She knew, in short, how to get into that building without going through the front door, and she had known it for years, and it had simply never been a thing she needed until now. She did not love the shape of the thought. Grace had never in her life taken a thing that wasn't hers, but she made herself follow it all the way to the end, the way Alina made her follow a Providence chain even when it led somewhere she didn't want it to go. The key was hers. Alina had left it to her. The box was hers in her name, established with her signature. She would not be stealing. She would be collecting an object a dead woman had willed to her, from a building that owed her 11 years, and had paid her out with 2 weeks in a cardboard box. Trespassing, it was still trespassing. She was honest with herself about that. But she was going to do it anyway, and she was going to do it right, the professional's way, with the light on and the loop out and a clear head. Because if she was going to cross a line she'd never crossed in 38 years, she was not going to do it clumsily. Friday, the cleaning crew, the propped stairwell door. 2 days. She spent the 2 days learning her own building again from the outside, which was a strange and lonely thing to do. She walked past it Wednesday evening at 6 and watched the windows, the warehouse floor emptied by 5:30 as it always had. The third floor stayed lit later, Roland's doing, she guessed. The man clearly kept the hours of someone with something to finish. By 7, the third floor went dark too, except for the perpetual green glow of the exit signs and the small red pulse of the alarm panel visible through the stairwell window if you knew where to look. Grace knew where to look. She walked past again Thursday and confirmed the pattern. And she thought, the whole time, about Lily. That was the part that sat wrong. If this went badly, if she was caught in that building at night by a man like Roland Vane, she was a 38-year-old unemployed single mother caught trespassing at her former employer, and no letter from a dead woman would keep that out of a courtroom, and Lily would be the one who paid for it. Grace had spent 15 years making sure that Lily's world was steady even when her own wasn't, and here she was about to put that steadiness on a scale against a brass key in a drawer. She almost didn't do it. What decided her was rereading the letter, late Thursday night, at the kitchen table with the lights off and the tree strand fading up and down. Be careful the way I taught you to appraise a forgery. Trust nothing that wants you to look away from it. Alina hadn't written go get the key. Alina had written trust nothing that wants you to look away. And the thing that most wanted Grace to look away, to leave the key where it was, to accept the box and the cardboard and the 2 weeks, to be a sensible mother and let it go, was the fear itself. The fear was the forgery. It looked like caution, and it was actually surrender. Alina had lied to her for 4 years to build this. Alina had sealed a letter with wax and hidden a key inside her enemy's own furniture, and set up a bank to phone Grace the instant anyone else so much as reached for the box. Alina had done all of that on the single bet that, when the moment came, Grace would be careful enough to succeed and brave enough to try. Grace was not going to be the reason Alina lost that bet. She went Friday. Grace had known the truth for 3 weeks now, and it had not made her feel powerful. It had made her feel like she was carrying something heavy across a frozen lake, listening for the crack. She'd gotten the key. That night was already going soft at the edges in her memory, the way frightening things do, the propped stairwell door, the dead woman's desk, the false bottom sliding free under her fingers with a little wooden sigh, the brass key cold in her palm and a second envelope beneath it, thicker than the first. She'd been in and out in under 20 minutes, and she'd thrown up in the alley afterward, quietly, from the adrenaline, and then she'd driven home and sat in the parked car outside her own building, until her hands stopped shaking enough to hold the wheel. The deposit box she'd opened 2 days later, in the quiet back room at Whitcomb and Reed, with the 19-year woman standing discreetly outside the door. And now she knew. The papers were spread across her kitchen table on a Tuesday night in late January, weighted at the corners with a coffee mug and a salt shaker, and the loop Alina had left her, and Grace had read them so many times she could recite the operative clauses. She read them again anyway, reaching for the light. The company was not owned by the Vanes. It had never been owned by the Vanes. Marcus Vane held a 19% minority interest, exactly as Alina's letter had said, granted by Charles in a fit of generosity Alina had spent the rest of her life regretting. The remaining 81% had belonged to Alina outright, and Alina, 14 months before her death, had placed that 81% into an irrevocable trust. The trust had one beneficiary: Grace Whitfield. Not the company left to Grace. Alina had been too clever for that, had said as much in the letter, knowing an outright bequest would be contested into dust. Instead, she'd moved the ownership into a structure that had already been standing, quietly, for over a year before she died. The transfer was old. It was notarized. It had cleared every waiting period the law imposed. There was nothing to contest because there was no recent act to attack, just a settled, seasoned trust that had been sitting there like a foundation under a house, while the Vanes redecorated the rooms above it, never once checking whose land it stood on. Grace owned 81% of Hartley and Vane. She had owned it, technically, since 14 months before Alina died. She had owned it on Christmas Eve, standing in the packing room, wrapping a porcelain figurine. She had owned it while Roland Vane sat at the head of a conference table and fired her from her own company for the crime of asking who owned it. That was the part that kept her up at night, not the theft of it, the comedy of it. Roland Vane had spent, by the letter's account, 15 years circling this business like a patient man waiting for a house to come vacant. He had waited Alina out. He had moved in. He had begun, carefully, to treat the people Alina loved as line items. And the very first line item he'd chosen to remove, personally, on a holiday, taking the trouble to come down himself and shut his nephew's mouth, was the one person on earth who actually held the deed. He didn't know. That was the thing Grace turned over and over. Roland Vane, for all his patience, did not know. If he'd known, he'd never have fired her. He'd have kept her close, watched her, waited to see if she suspected anything. Firing her was the act of a man who was certain she was nothing, which meant the trust had done exactly what a leaner built it to do. It had stayed invisible, even to the man hunting for it. Which raised the question Grace had been avoiding for 3 weeks. Why fire her at all? If she was nothing, a warehouse packer, a line item, you don't send the senior man on Christmas Eve to remove her personally. You let HR do it in March. Roland's presence in that room was the one detail that didn't fit the story he thought he was in. He believed she was nothing, and he had treated her like a threat, and both things could not be true. Grace pulled the second envelope toward her, the thick one from beneath the key. She'd read it too, of course, that first day in the bank, and it hadn't answered the question, it had deepened it. Because the second envelope wasn't from a leaner. It was older than a leaner's letter. The paper had yellowed at the folds. It was a set of documents a leaner had clearly collected rather than authored copies, some of them, a few originals, and a single sheet in a leaner's hand clipped to the top that said only, "Grace, this is why they will come for the company, and why they cannot be allowed to have it. I did not understand it fully myself until 3 years ago. When you understand it, you will understand why I could not simply hand it to you across a desk. Some inheritances have to be earned in the reading. E." What followed was a history Grace was still assembling. It went back to Charles, Alina's late husband, Marcus Vane's benefactor, the man whose birthday had opened the third-floor keypad. And it went back further than Charles, to the founding of the auction house itself, to a period in the company's early decades that its glossy centenary brochure described in one warm paragraph about craftsmanship and trust, and did not describe at all, in any real way, because the real way was in these papers, and the papers had never been meant to be found. Hartley and Vane had built its early reputation, and a great deal of its early money, on estate sales. Grand houses, whole collections, families selling off centuries of accumulation. Respectable work, except that in a specific window Grace was still pinning down the exact years. The house had handled a series of estate liquidations for families who had acquired their collections in circumstances the brochure would never mention. Collections assembled during a period when a great many valuable things changed hands under duress, from people who were in no position to refuse the sale or to survive it. The auction house had not asked where the pieces came from. That was the whole business model. Careful is the whole business, dear. Alina had said that to Grace on her first day, and Grace had thought it was about tape and tissue paper, and it had meant something much older and much darker, and Alina had known it when she said it. Charles had known. That was clear from the papers. Charles had inherited the house from the Hartley side and had inherited with it the knowledge of where some of the foundation money came from, and Charles had done nothing, because doing something would have unmade the company. And Marcus Vane, marrying in, angling for his 19%, Marcus had learned it too, somewhere along the way. And Roland Vane did not want the company because it was a profitable auction house. There were easier profitable things to own. Roland wanted the company because whoever controlled Hartley and Vane controlled its archive. 100 years of sale records, provenance files, client correspondence, and somewhere in that archive was the documentary proof of what the house had done and whose it had really been. And a determined person holding those records could either bury them forever or use them, and either way the power was enormous. There were living families. There were descendants on both sides of every one of those transactions. There were, Alina's note implied, restitution claims that had never been made because the evidence to make them sat locked inside the very company that had profited from denying them. Alina had spent the last years of her life quietly understanding what she owned. And then she had made sure it would pass not to the Vanes, who would bury it, but to Grace. Some inheritances have to be earned in the reading. Grace understood now why Alina hadn't handed it across a desk. It wasn't only that the Vanes would have contested a simple bequest. It was that Eleanor couldn't hand a person this and say good luck. She had to trust that the person she gave it to would be careful enough to hold it and brave enough to use it and decent enough to use it right. And Eleanor had spent 11 years at a lamp with a loupe, finding out whether Grace was that person, and had decided she was, and had bet the whole thing on it. Grace sat at her kitchen table and understood that she had not been left a company. She'd been left a debt, 100 years old, and the authority to finally pay it. "Mom," Lily was in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, hair everywhere, squinting against the light. "It's 1 in the morning. Why are you doing paperwork at 1 in the morning?" Grace looked up. She'd gotten very good over 3 weeks at gathering the papers before Lily came in, a quick practice sweep, mug and salt shaker off, everything squared and turned face down. She did it now automatically and saw Lily watch her do it, and saw Lily's face change. "You've been doing that for weeks," Lily said. "The hiding thing. Every time I come in you flip everything over." She came further into the kitchen, arms crossed, 15 and unfooled. "Are we in trouble, like money trouble, because you can tell me?" "I'd rather know." And Grace, who had spent 15 years keeping her daughter's world steady, who had lied to a bank teller and broken into a building and read 100 years of other people's buried grief at this same table, Grace looked at her daughter and made a decision that surprised her. "Sit down," she said. "No, we're not in money trouble." She pulled out the chair beside her. "It's more complicated than that, and I've been trying to figure out how much of it to tell you, and I think the answer is all of it, because you're not a little kid and I'm going to need someone in this house who knows the truth. Can you handle the truth being big?" Lily sat. "How big?" "I own the company that fired me on Christmas Eve," Grace said. "I've owned it the whole time. And that's not even the strange part." Lily stared at her. "The strange part," Grace said, "is what the company did a long time ago to end up worth owning, and the fact that the man who fired me would burn this whole building down before he'd let it come out." She squared the face-down papers under her hand but didn't turn them over yet. "Eleanor left it to me, not to keep. I've been reading her for 3 weeks and I think she left it to me to finish. And I haven't decided yet whether I'm brave enough to do what she wanted, or whether I should take what's mine, sell it back to them quietly and buy us a house and a life and never think about any of it again." She looked at her daughter. "That's the real thing keeping me up, not money." The tree was down. They'd taken it down on the 6th, the way they always did, but the kitchen was very quiet in the way of 1 in the morning, and Lily was looking at her mother like she was seeing a person she hadn't fully met before. "What would Eleanor do?" Lily asked finally. "Eleanor's dead. She already did her part. This part's mine." "That's not what I asked." Lily reached over and before Grace could stop her, turned the top paper face up and looked at it, the yellowed folds, the old careful typeface, a dead woman's clipped note in slanting hand. She read Eleanor's line at the top. "Some inheritances have to be earned in the reading," and she looked up. "She didn't leave it to you so you could sell it back to them," Lily said. "You already know that. That's why you can't sleep." Grace didn't answer. Outside, a car went by with its chains on, and Grace Whitfield sat at her kitchen table with her daughter, an 81% of a 100-year-old company, and understood that the decision she'd been telling herself she hadn't made was one she'd actually made 3 weeks ago, in a bank, the moment she read the second envelope, and that everything since had just been her working up the courage to admit it. The first ally was the last person Grace expected, and she found him because she stopped trying to be invisible. For 3 weeks she'd moved like a thief in her own life, hiding papers, driving past the building at night, flinching at the phone. But a thief was the wrong thing to be. Eleanor hadn't left her a company to sneak around the edges of. So on a gray morning in early February, Grace put on her good coat and walked into the offices of the one man whose name appeared, over and over, in the margins of Eleanor's oldest papers. a solicitor named Aldous Finch, retired now, who had drawn up the original trust and whose spidery initials sat beside Alina's on documents going back further than Grace's whole tenure at the house. Finch was 81 and lived alone in a narrow house full of clocks, and when Grace gave her name at the door, he went still in exactly the way the bank teller had gone still, the recognition of a name long expected. "So she set it in motion," he said, before Grace had said anything at all. "Come in. Mind the runner, it's treacherous." He led her through a hall that ticked in 40 voices. "I've been waiting 2 years for you to knock. I'd nearly decided you weren't going to. You knew about me. I drafted you, my dear, on paper. I've known your name longer than you've known it mattered." He lowered himself into a chair with the care of the very old. "Alina came to me 15 months before she died. She'd finally finished reading her own company. Took her the better part of 3 years, poor woman. She nearly couldn't bear it, and she came to me and she said, 'Aldous, I've found the rot in the foundations and I can't be the one to pull the house down. I'm too old and too tired and too much a part of it. But I know who can be.'" He looked at Grace with pale, sharp eyes. "She meant you. She'd been watching you 11 years. She said you were the only person she'd ever met who couldn't be talked out of the truth once you'd seen it. She said it like it was your best quality and your curse both." Grace's throat was tight. "Then you know what's in the archive." "I know it exists. I know roughly what it proves. And I know," Finch said, "that Hartley Vane has been trying to get physical control of that archive for the better part of a year, quietly, through the courts, through pressure on the trustees, through every lever a patient, greedy man can find. He believes whoever holds the records holds everything. He's right. What he doesn't know, what he cannot conceive of, is that the person who holds the records is a woman he fired from the packing room." The old man almost smiled. "Alina's finest hour. She hid the deed inside the one person he'd never search." "Why did he fire me then?" It was the question that had kept her up for a month. If he doesn't know, why send himself on Christmas Eve for a packer? Finch's smile faded. "Ah, that. I wondered if you'd worked round to it." He steepled his fingers. "He doesn't know you own it, Grace, but he knows Alina trusted you. Someone told him, a clerk, a whisper, I don't know who, that Alina spent her last years with a warehouse woman she talked to about the collection late at night. And Hartley Vane is a man who removes anyone who was close to Alina near the end, on the simple principle that they might know something. He didn't fire you because you're the owner. He fired you because you're a loose thread and he tugs loose threads." The old eyes fixed on her. "He fired you to be safe. And in doing it, he handed the one person who could destroy him her freedom, her grievance, and all the time in the world." Grace sat in a house full of clocks and understood the shape of the whole thing at last. Roland's caution had been the very thing that armed her. "I need your help," she said. "You've had it since before we met," said Aldous Finch. "Now tell me what you intend. And be careful how you answer, because I'll hold you to it. Alina did not leave you a weapon to swing wildly. What she intended took her the rest of February to build, and she built it the way she'd built everything, like a shipment. Intact, past obstacles on a schedule with the right documentation. She did not go to the newspapers. That was the swing Finch had warned against, the wild one, the one that would have made a splash and then a legal fog, denials and countersuits, and the archive vanishing into a shredder while lawyers argued. Alina hadn't spent 15 months building a seasoned, unassailable trust so that Grace could throw it away on a headline. Instead, she did the patient thing, the professional thing. Finch put her in touch with 2 people. The first was a woman named Ruth Adamy, a Providence researcher who spent her career reuniting looted collections with the families they'd been stolen from, and who wept, actually wept, quietly at Finch's kitchen table when Grace laid out what the Hartley and Vane archive contained. "Do you know how many families I've had to turn away?" Ruth said, "because the records were sealed, because the house that sold their grandparents' things claimed it had nothing. You're telling me it was there all along." The second was a trustee of the trust itself, a careful accountant named Peter Whitlock, who had been quietly appalled by Rowland's pressure for a year, and who, when Grace produced her documentation, went very pale and very calm and said, "Ms. Whitfield, I have been waiting for someone to walk in that door with standing to act. You have standing. Tell me what you need." By the end of February, Grace Whitfield had a solicitor, a researcher, a trustee, and 81% of the votes. And she had a date, because Hartley and Vane, like all such houses, held an annual gathering, a spring reception for major clients, board members, the press, the great and the moneyed, the very people whose good opinion the company lived and died on. Rowland had kept it on the calendar. Of course he had. It was the stage on which the Vanes intended to present themselves as the settled, respectable owners of a 100-year-old institution. Grace decided to let them keep the stage. She was simply going to change the program. She almost lost her nerve twice. Once a week before, when a letter arrived from the company's lawyers, sent to all former staff, boilerplate, a reminder of confidentiality obligations. And for one cold hour she was a fired packer again, small and afraid, sure she'd imagined her own strength. Lily found her at the kitchen table with the letter and read it and said flatly, "This is a form letter, Mom. They send it to everybody. They don't even know what you have," and she was right, and the fear was a forgery, and Grace put it down. And once, the night before, when she stood in Lily's doorway and watched her daughter sleep and thought about everything that could go wrong in a room full of powerful people, and how a woman who did this and lost might not have a soft place to land, and neither would her child. But she'd made this decision in a bank in January. She was only still working up the courage to have made it. So she went to bed, and she slept badly, and in the morning she put on the good coat. The reception was held in the main gallery on the ground floor of Hartley and Vane, under the tall windows, among the season's finest lots displayed on their velvet stands. Grace walked in through the front door this time in daylight, and Terence at the entrance saw her and did a small double take and then, very slightly, stood a little straighter and did not stop her. She'd sent him a note 2 days before. "Don't stop me at the door on Thursday and don't get in front of anything that happens. Whatever comes after, your job is safe. You have my word, and by Thursday you'll understand why my word is good." She'd signed it Grace. She didn't know if he'd believed her, but he stood straighter and he let her pass, and she loved him a little for the risk of it. The room was full. Champagne, low music, the particular murmur of people performing wealth at one another. Nathan Vane was near the front, miserable in a good suit, and he saw her and his face did something complicated. And at the center, holding court, gray suit, was Rowland Vane, patient, settled, telling some story to a cluster of board members and a journalist, a man who had waited 15 years and believed he had finally won. He saw her across the room. She watched him place her, the packer, the loose thread, tugged and removed, and she watched him fail to understand why the loose thread was standing in his gallery in a good coat with 3 people arranged quietly behind her. Aldous Finch, leaning on his stick. Peter Whitlock, the trustee, ashen and resolute. Ruth Adamy, with a slim folder held against her chest like something breakable. Rowland came toward her because a man like Rowland always closes distance. It's how he controls a room. "You're not welcome here," he said, pleasantly, quietly for her ears. "You've had your severance. Don't embarrass yourself." "Mr. Vane," Grace said, and she did not lower her voice, and heads began to turn. "I own 81% of this company. I have owned it since before Eleanor Hartley died. It was placed in trust for me, notarized, seasoned, and it is beyond your reach. This gentleman is the trustee, and he will confirm it. This gentleman is the solicitor who drafted it. And this woman," she nodded to Ruth, "is going to spend the next several years doing the thing this house was built to prevent." The room had gone quiet the way a room does when it senses blood. Rowland Vane's face did not move, and its not moving was the most frightened thing Grace had ever seen. "You're delusional," he said. "Whatever Eleanor told you." "Eleanor didn't tell me anything." Grace reached into her coat and produced not the trust papers, those were with Finch safe, but a single photocopied page from the archive, one Ruth had chosen precisely, a sale record with a name on it, a family's name, a collection sold under duress a lifetime ago by the house whose champagne these people were drinking. She left me the records, all of them, the whole 100 years, including the part in the brochure that says craftsmanship and trust, and the part that isn't in the brochure at all. She turned slightly so the journalist could hear. This company made its foundation money selling things that were taken from people who couldn't say no. It has spent a century pretending the records didn't exist. They exist. I have them. And as the majority owner, I have instructed the trust to open them, every file, to Ms. Adami, and to the families who have been told for decades that there was nothing to find. She looked at Roland. You fired me because you thought I was nothing. You were half right. I was nothing to you, which is exactly why she gave it to me. You'd never look in the packing room for the deed to your own empire. She almost smiled and didn't, because it wasn't a smiling moment. It was heavier than that. You waited 15 years for a dead woman to leave you a company. She left you me. Nobody moved. The journalist was writing. Peter Whitlock stepped forward and, in the dry, calm voice of an accountant reading a ledger, confirmed every word: the trust, the percentage, the standing. And the confirmation was worse for Roland than any accusation could have been, because it was boring and true and could not be shouted down. Roland Vane looked around the room he'd thought he owned, at the board members already stepping back from him, at the journalist, at his nephew Nathan, who was looking at Grace with something that might, in a better man, grow into shame. And Roland understood, finally and completely, that patience had not been enough, that he had been so careful he'd removed the one person he most needed to keep close, and handed her everything, and never known. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He set down his champagne and he walked out of the gallery, past Terence, into the gray afternoon, and that was the last time Grace Whitfield ever saw him. It did not resolve cleanly, because real things don't. The families came slowly. Ruth's work took years, not weeks. Providence is patient work, and grief is patient too, and some of the descendants were suspicious, and some were gone, and some wept the way Ruth had wept. Not every claim could be proven. Not every wrong could be made right, but some could. Over the following 2 years, 3 collections went home, then a 4th. A small foundation was set up, in Aliner's name, funded from the company's profits. To do the finding, Grace insisted on Aliner's name, over Finch's gentle suggestion that she use her own. She spent 3 years reading the rot and couldn't bear to be the one to pull the house down, Grace said. She earned the name on the door. Grace ran the company. She was, it turned out, extraordinary at it, because she knew every job in the building from the packing room up, and because she'd learned appraisal at Aliner's lamp, and because the staff who had watched a fired packer walk back in as the owner would have followed her into a fire. She kept Terence. She kept Dev, who fed the label printer at an angle to the end of his days and never once got it right. She did not keep Roland's structure, or Roland's people, or Roland's silence. Nathan Vane she kept for a while on probation because he'd had the decency to look sick in that conference room on Christmas Eve, and because Grace believed Aliner's belief, really, the one she'd inherited along with everything else, that a person could be more than the worst room they'd ever stood in. Nathan surprised her. Not immediately. Gradually, the way real change comes. It was Aliner's whole thesis about people, and Grace had become its keeper. And Lily grew up in a house that was steady, a real house, eventually, with a garden, in a home where the truth had been big, and the family had been able to hold it. She was there, 17 by then, when the first collection went home to its family, and she watched her mother stand quietly at the back of the room while other people wept and thanked and could not believe it. And afterward, in the car, she said, "You never take the front, Mom. You always stand at the back." "The back's where you see the whole room," Grace said. "Aliner taught me that. You reach for the light first, then you look." She drove them home. The heater ticked. And Grace Whitfield, who had been fired on Christmas Eve from a company she didn't know she owned, who had carried 100-year-old debt across a frozen lake and reached the far shore without going through, thought about a dead woman's slanting hand, and a brass key in a drawer, and a bet made on the single quality Alina had prized above every appraisal she ever taught, that once Grace Whitfield had truly seen a thing, no one on earth could talk her out of it. She'd been right. It had been Grace's best quality and her curse, and in the end it had been enough.